We'll go ahead and start recording. Thank you so much, everyone. We have today a few incredible presenters. My name is Dr. Krystal Tsosie. I am an Indigenous geneticist and ethicist here at Arizona State University. My co-host, Maui Hudson, is a call to Columbia for reasons related to a metadata labeling project that he's starting. So I have the honor of leading the session with our three speakers. So we have joining us Celine Clairayard, sorry, who is right now at the airport. Her presentation has been pre-recorded. It's amazing. We have also joining us Alex um, is your name Alex? Alex Alexis, I'm so sorry. And also Katie Lee Riddle. Thank you so much for joining us. If you do not mind, I'm going to use this quick opportunity to present on behalf of Maui Hudson and myself a bit of a grounding on Indigenous data sovereignty and some of the foundational topics related to this larger topic area. Can you all see my lecture slides? Great, perfect, thank you. So as I mentioned, my name is Dr. Tsosie. I'm an associate director also at the Biodiversity Knowledge Integration Center, ASU, and also co-founder of the Native Biodata Consortium. I want to first acknowledge that much of our history is related to biology, and it is also rooted in collecting and collectivizing samples and data that have originated from Indigenous, or rather global Indigenous populations who have often had traditional knowledges and wisdoms that have been co-opted by largely white settler scientists as part of their discoveries. And this is a picture of the London Natural History Museum of some of the botanical discoveries that were attributed not to the indigenous peoples that originated these knowledges, but to scientists instead. So a central question in this new stage that we find ourselves is how to ensure that we're not exploiting these systems and deriving DSI from collected biospecimens. Often, Indigenous peoples, we are promised that there would be some sort of community benefit that is derived from our Indigenous genetic knowledges, but in reality, what ends up happening is corporations are able to profit, or even academic researchers profit in a type of academic currency in the form of papers, publications, prestige. But often, unfortunately, Indigenous peoples are not benefiting proximally in reasonable timeframes from their own traditional knowledges. And yet, if they're the ones that are providing the source material that bring about innovations, then we really have to ask whether or not the system is fair, lowercase fair, and whether or not we are really advancing equity. It's really funny that we have a lot of conversations stemming from ethics and equity in the spaces of recent, but who is defining what is ethical, or what those ethics terms are itself can be colonial. So for instance, when researchers define ethics, when they think about benefit sharing, it's often thinking about benefits distributing already across this environment of settler institutions, and we don't really think beyond academia or industry in these terms. And also, when we sometimes define equity and fairness, it's nearly defined through distribution to other researchers, for instance, through open data sharing. And this is important because while we champion FAIR, capital F-A-I-R, in many of our data ethics and emerging data governance principles to guide our disciplines, in actuality, if you read it with a sort of a critical lens and take into account histories of how and who normally does science, it really doesn't talk about community impact or impact beyond scientific communities. And we really have to think about also whose ethics are we centering here, and responsibility to whom. So really happy that to advocate for both fair and care principles, care being championed by Gita Institute or run by Dr. Stephanie Carroll. And there's a grounding document for that. Well, the central topic today is related to Indigenous data sovereignty. I myself, as a genetic epidemiologist, really think of this in terms of Indigenous genomic data sovereignty as the right of Indigenous nations and peoples to exercise authority, agency, and autonomy to protect their interests related to genomic data. And I remind that this is an intrinsic right at the community level. It's not dependent on colonial power definitions of who is and who is not sovereign, which is important when you think about within the US. Only federally recognized tribal nations are recognized by our federal government, and yet we have a number of state and unrecognized communities, including in the Pacific Islands. And even though I'm a co-author on one of the foundational works to bring in community-based participatory research into genomics, I had to tell you that this paper is just laying the groundwork, and the questions about how to do community engagement, how to advance community engagement, those are still works that are forthcoming. This paper was already outdated when it was published, but it was necessary to vocalize these principles in the space of genomics, because quite honestly, genomics had a lot to reckon with. And we also need to think about these principles in terms of biodiversity genomics as well. Because while CBPR advocates for community engagement at all phases of research, in actuality, there's a lot of ways to circumvent this. So in a compassionate way of describing this on the behalf of researchers is that researchers in the genomic space, by and large, don't have training in engagement methods. And also we are beholden to a publish and perish atmosphere in which we don't have adequate funding. It's often difficult to identify appropriate partners. A lack of consensus with multiple communities are involved. And we also are working within a landscape of conflicting policies at multiple levels. And they do advocate for more grant funding and training in these areas. But we also have to be aware that there's a danger in which researchers co-opt engagement language to basically facilitate the status quo or the same old type of research techniques. This is a paper about that after 10 plus years of researchers being told that they need to consult with descendant communities, they, in their ethics statement, stated that they did not seek the permission of the tribe who represents the modern day descendants of Sitting Bull, who was an incredible cultural figure for many, many Native American tribes. But this researcher stated that they sent one email, the height of the pandemic in August 2020, did not receive a response, and then decided to publish anyway. And that was their checkmark process for what they constitute proper ethical engagement of the communities. So what do I mean by communities? I think there's a danger here in that we as scientists only think about scientific communities across each of our different taxa or across our species of interest. But I actually want everyone to acknowledge that there are other communities that we need to consider, especially when we consider the histories of theft and co-optation, and we need to consider more appropriately Indigenous communities as partners. And that we also don't want to engage in engagement washing language, where we're just using engagement language to continue to do the same type of activities that do not shift the power dynamic. And that we also have to think about engagement at all stages of the research process. So I am so grateful to now turn to the stage Katie Lee Riddle, which I think who will give us a greater understanding about some of these terms and also give us a benchmark for discussion. Thank you, Katie.
Hi, thank you for having me. I will share my presentation first of all. Most of my presentation today is going to center on how do I make it present? Where is it? How would the button work there? Okay. Because I've been at the Convention on Biological Diversity Conference of the Parties of the last 2 weeks, we've seen some really interesting developments in the space of digital sequence information, and I figured that today, the semi-final document that's about to be passed, hopefully today, has come out just this morning. I would provide some updates on that and what it means for us. So, for those of you who aren't fully aware already, the Convention on Biological Diversity is an international treaty that was open for signature in 92. There are three key pillars to it. There is conservation of biological diversity, sustainable use of biodiversity components, and the fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from genetic resources. A subsidiary agreement from United Nations CBD is the Nagoya Protocol, and this is about the fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from the use of genetic resources. One of the biggest problems with Nagoya is that the definition of genetic resources under Nagoya does not cover digital sequence information. Digital sequence information is the genetic coding that underlies the genetic resources. So when you run it through a sequencing machine and you come out with a whole bunch of base pairs, this in essential is DSI. And there are many different types of it, and it's not currently a defined term. So what is and what isn't DSI is quite loosely understood at the moment. But it's not, as it doesn't fall under this definition, it's not considered a genetic resource, and therefore it's not subject to the same kind of access and benefit sharing regulations that you would expect of it. And this has meant that there's been a huge lack of benefit sharing arrangements, especially for Indigenous peoples and local communities and First Nations. And we're missing out on crucial financial opportunities. And so at the last COP 15, decision 15.9 came out, in which they basically agreed to develop a solution for this. And so this is where the last 2 years have wound up. So today at COP 16, we're going to hopefully be seeing the finalization of a multilateral mechanism for the fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from the use of DSI on genetic resources. So what does that mean? So it's an international mechanism. So when you use and access digital sequence information, you may be liable to share financial or non-monetary benefits either into this fund or with the community that needs it. So with one of the biggest problems with DSI is that you use it in the aggregate, you're using it from multiple different communities. And a lot of the time there is no geographical origin information there sitting with it. And so it's really hard to have any kind of bilateral arrangements there. So this multilateral mechanism takes that and puts it in a way that makes it a bit easier for scientists to use. And then they have that legal certainty to say, okay, we've done our obligations under benefit sharing, we've done the right thing, we're not going to get sued later down the track. And it provides that certainty. So within that, there are a couple of key issues being discussed. So who should be liable to pay and when? Who should hold the fund, like who should host it and who should be in charge of it? The governance of the fund and the governance of the mechanism. So the multilateral mechanism as a whole, the way that we use and share and operate with DSI, and then also the way that we're sharing the benefits from the use of DSI. Then there's fund distribution. So who gets money and when? And then review of the mechanism. So how do we review how it's working later on down the track? So within this discussion on DSI, there's a couple of balancing things that we're trying to find an equilibrium between. So there's consent and governance. So for Indigenous peoples, we have a more collective ownership style where we're the kaitiaki, or we're the stewards of the things held in our lands and waters. Whereas consent comes from more of an individual right to utilize a resource, which is a very Western way of understanding property law. So balancing those two things, the right to use and the right to access. Using genetic resources has a shared benefit, whereas accessing them may have more of an exclusive benefit. And then there's also the rights and interests of ownership and co-ownership and governance and taking care of things. So the control that comes along with that. Okay, So within the Convention on Biological Diversity, there is a sector there called the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity. And they are the representatives of all the Indigenous people and local communities that send their representatives there. So we all come together in this forum, and together we collectively make our position statements and advocate on behalf of Indigenous rights at the CBD. I am one of the co-negotiators or co-leaders for the working group on DSI. So myself and Preston Hudson have been leading the negotiations on behalf of Indigenous peoples here for the past 2 weeks. Also for the past 2 years, we've both been heavily involved. So together as a working group, so all of the individuals within the IIFB who are interested in DSI and want to have a say, we all come together and we develop position statements, and then we use those to negotiate on the floor. So I want to take you through a couple of the options that were discussed, and then as of today, what has been decided. So all users of DSI should be encouraged to share benefits, and all users should be able to share non-monetary benefits. The exception for that is the public databases, academia, and public research institutions, where they're currently not expected to make monetary contributions to the Global Fund. This was something that was kind of contentious for us, but unfortunately it didn't swing our way. We were hoping that everybody who created a monetary benefit from the use of DSI would be eligible to pay. But however, they felt that there needed to be some specific carve-outs for particular types of use. So payment for use of DSI can either go directly into the fund or it can be directed through a national authority. And how this is going to work is slightly complex, so I'd recommend you read the document when it comes out. But there's going to be a tiered system where entities that that use and rely on DSI have to pay a certain percentage, and it's going to be 1% of sales or 0.1% of their revenue. And this is going to be on a tiered system. So large companies pay a larger amount, the medium-sized companies pay less, and then the small companies don't have the burden of these really high fees. So this was developed by the London School of Economics, who have worked closely with the IFB over the past few years on DSI. And we were quite pleased to see that this was the one that's currently chosen to be hopefully what will be signed into agreement today. Here's the actual wording of that. I don't expect you to read that right now, but there's just talking about the different assets or profits or sales. So they're looking at the different criteria you would use to show what a large company actually is. And there is an annex or an enclosure in the document with specific sectors that identify which particular sectors may be liable to pay. It's an indicative list. Next, we'll talk about the money out of the fund. So who does the fund go to? It was previously agreed that Indigenous people and local communities would get the majority of the funds. However, over time, this has been watered down a bit for other priorities as well. And there were also some parties or countries that felt that they should have the final say in where the money goes to their communities in their country. So what was finally agreed was a hybrid model. So where direct funding will be given to Indigenous people and local communities wherever possible, most likely on a project basis. And then it can either go directly to the community or it can go to their self-identified institutions or research partners that can hold the funds on their behalf. Or it can go to governments, which then can decide where the funds go from there. And it will be hosted by the UN Multi-Partner Trust Fund Office, which is under the authority of the CBD. Going forward, there is a steering committee that will be established that gets to talk about the different funding criteria or how we prioritize who should get the money, because there's a huge amount of things to be balanced. There's the level of biodiversity richness in a country, where that country is based, the level of development of that country, the capacity needs of the community, and how much is actually available in the fund. The more money we have in the fund, the more we're able to apportion it between different projects. But if there's only a little amount, then what is the most crucial to fund immediately? So this steering committee is going to be made up of a whole bunch of different representatives, as you'll see on the right-hand side of the screen. And we, as Indigenous people and local communities, have 7 representatives, 1 from each sociocultural region. Every 2 years, the fund will be reviewed, and this will be adjusted to get stronger, hopefully, over time. There's also some rules created for databases, but they are, as it's a voluntary mechanism, these are just suggestions. So within the CBD text, we're very pleased to say that FAIR and CARE have been suggested and adopted to be part of fund database governance, and then also the trust principles and the UNESCO recommendation on open science. So they're saying that databases should give heed to all of these different recommendations and go from there. Also, they have to make information on the mechanism available. They have to request submitters to indicate that they have the right to put the data in the database in the first place. And this may mean talking about the prior informed consent of the community to have generated this DSI as well, and submit that data in compliance with their benefit sharing obligations. Now, what's really exciting, and what I'm going to get into a little bit more, is that they have to disclose the country of origin for the DSI and, where applicable, biocultural metadata, including traditional knowledge origins. Let's talk about what biocultural metadata actually is, because this is a term that's not really been used in international law before. So it's about the Indigenous connection to land, waters, and territories. And so it's naming our community, saying this data comes from this Indigenous community, or it might be using the local context traditional knowledge labels and notices. It also indicates whether traditional knowledge has been used in the generation of this DSI or not. So there's a couple of reasons this is really important. It helps with the new WIPO treaty. The new WIPO treaty on patents requires you to disclose the Indigenous community that the traditional knowledge has come from. So it really helps researchers using DSI to indicate who they should go and have a talk to if they want to have a relationship with a community and use traditional knowledge. And also, we've been talking about how DSI is provenance is a cross-cutting issue across multiple fora. Okay, so bioculture metadata has a whole bunch of purposes. It helps our connection, show our connection to the land, make it visible, helps us as Indigenous people be able to see what's held about our lands, waters, and territories and use the data. It helps us give more autonomy in research. It helps right historical wrongs where data has been taken without our consent. It helps empower us as leaders of research and help us to give Indigenous-led solutions to biodiversity. So just to close off, here's a couple of takeaway points for things you can do in your workplace, in your own context, that may help to improve how you enhance Indigenous data sovereignty and operationalize the things that we're seeing in the fund. So we're seeing a huge amount of support for the use of the local context, traditional knowledge, and biocultural labels. We are seeing databases increasingly use them in relation to genetic resources in DSI. And so having a real consideration about how you can use them is really important. Considering how data sovereignty can be operationalized in the context of your workplace. And if you're using DSI, how do you enhance Indigenous control and relationships to it? And considering how can you become a trailblazer? You're seeing that across all these international fora, Indigenous rights and Indigenous provenance is becoming more and more common. So how can you get ahead of the curve? Think about the different data that you use and how you connect it to the communities. And whenever you're conducting research, consider what kind of impact they may have on the communities. And especially with intellectual property rights going forward with WIPO, and as you'll see in the provenance things here, it's really important to consider what kind of disclosure you may be needing for future compliance and to be in line with the way that the world is going in terms of recognizing Indigenous rights in data. I have a couple of key resources here for you. He Tohu Arahi is a guidelines document that we put out recently. It's for Indigenous communities in New Zealand to use when they're creating research relationships. We have information on the care principles, Te Mataira guidelines for genomic research, the Newcastle ICIP guidelines. These are all amazing resources out there that I consider you go have a look at and see what resonates with you and see what you can take back into your everyday work. This is a really short version of things that I've been talking about for a very long time. So, of course, there's going to be a lot more to unpack now and in the future. So I'm really open to questions, or if you have something that may take a bit longer than the time we have, then I really recommend you flick me an email. And thank you so much. Kia ora.
Yora, yeah, thank you so much. Alex, if you would like to take over next, please do so.
Hello, everyone. So it is an honor for me to be on live with you today. And before I begin, I would like to emphasize our four points. First, I would like to thank the co-chairs, Krystal, Tsosie, and Hudson, for giving me the opportunity to discuss this very important topic. Secondly, since I'm currently in Cali for COP16, I would like to acknowledge the presence of indigenous peoples, Afro-descendants, and local communities who, from their respective territories, contribute to the preservation of biodiversity. And thirdly, I would like to point out that as a young Black researcher from Haiti and the Caribbean, my perspective is partly influenced by this region. And as a non-Indigenous person, my words do not represent or replace those of Indigenous peoples who hold the right to self-determination, including epistemic self-determination. Fourthly, I would prefer to make this presentation in my native languages rather than English, in which I feel less comfortable. Thus, for any question under a Q&A session requiring complex answers, maybe, I may respond via chat or email. With that, let's dive into the subject of my presentation, which focuses on the digitized genetic resources, also known as digital sequence information, or DSI, and indigenous data sovereignty. Specifically, the objective of my presentation is to discuss Decision 15/9 on DSI adopted at the 15th Conference of the Parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity held in December 2022 in Montreal, and to examine the place of this decision within the emerging international legal ecosystem of data and open science. To do this, I will first return to the origins, terms, and issues of this controversy. And the second part, I will delve into the heart of the matter. That is how Decision 15/9 seeks to balance the tensions between open data and indigenous data sovereignty, and how it positions itself within the emerging field of international law of open data and science. First, origins, terms, and issues of the DSI controversy at the Convention on Biological Diversity. To understand the controversy surrounding DSI, we need to go back at least to the 1980s. This period saw growing awareness of biodiversity loss, the development of biotechnology, and the bioeconomy, the expansion of intellectual property rights, and the patenting of life forms, the global affirmation of indigenous rights at an international level, and the promotion of traditional knowledge, along with increasing concerns about biopiracy. Biopiracy broadly refers to the illegitimate appropriation of biological resources and associated traditional knowledge by scientists and industries, often through patent laws. To address these challenges, states adopted the Convention on Biological Diversity, or CBD, and 1992 in Rio de Janeiro. This convention pursues three goals. First, biodiversity conservation. Second, sustainable use for biodiversity, and third, fair and equitable benefit sharing arising from the utilization of genetic resources. And the CBD defines genetic resources globally as plant, animal, microbial, or other material containing functional units of heredity with actual or potential value. In 2010, the CBD parties adopted the Nagoya Protocol, a legal instrument that specifies and mandates the conditions of access and benefit sharing under the CBD's third objective. The protocol mandates prior informed consent, or PIC, from the provider state and our indigenous communities holding traditional knowledge. Benefit sharing, in turn, is subject to mutually agreed terms, or MAT, between the provider and the user of the resources or knowledge. However, with the rise of high-throughput sequencing and genomics, genetic resources are increasingly digitized and made freely available in international databases. such as Genbank, for example, bypassing the Nagoya Protocol's rules. This digitization enables circumvention of the ABS, access and benefit sharing principle. The controversy then arises over whether and how DSI should be included in the Nagoya Protocol broadly. Two blocks have emerged. Another block comprising most northern states, scientists, and industries that argue DSI should not fall under the Nagoya Protocol, and a southern bloc representing most southern states, indigenous representatives, and environmental NGOs, which advocates for DSI to respect the ABS principle. Both blocs present ontological, legal, economic, and political arguments, which I want to delve into all of them. However, it is curious that only in 2016 did DSI-related benefit sharing enter the CBD agenda, even though large-scale sequencing practices were well established when the Nagoya Protocol was adopted in 2010. So let's now examine how Decision 15/9 addresses this issue, adopted at COP15 in Montreal. So part 2, Decision 15/9 from COP15 between open data, indigenous data sovereignty, and benefit sharing. So the main decision of Decision 15/9 is arguably the establishment of a multilateral benefit sharing mechanism, so DSI, including a global fund. This decision represents a compromise between a strict adherence to ABS principle under the Nagoya Protocol model and proponents of open access to DSI. The compromise is that DSI access is not subject to the original genetic resource provider's prior and informed consent, but benefits arising from DSI utilization must be shared via a multilateral mechanism, including a global fund for conservation and sustainable biodiversity projects. Decision 15/9 also demonstrates strategic caution right from early establishing a multilateral mechanisms. It leaves open the possibility of future exceptions after through ROG evaluation, preserving negotiation space for stakeholders. COP15 also appended to the decision a set of questions to explore for the mechanism's future operationalization, including governance of the front-end data, benefit sharing, relations with national laws, and the rights and interests of various stakeholders, including indigenous peoples. These issues are currently under discussion at the COP16 in Cali, and Kathy Lee Riddle just presented the emerging consensus at Cali on these points, which I believe is the focus of our presentation. So now let's examine how these decisions aligns with the international law of open data and science. Today, a burgeoning array of international legal instruments promotes open data. Some, like recent regional trade agreements with open data clauses for European data the European data governance legislation, adopt a market-oriented approach, while others take a human rights-oriented approach, such as access to information as part of freedom of expression in most international human rights conventions. Despite their diverse objectives and sectoral focus, these instruments show two aspects. First, they mainly concern public sector data to be liberated, as opposed to private sector data, which remains largely restricted. Second, they adopt a normative structure similar to that of the principle as open as possible, as close as necessary. So the global success of this formula, as open as possible, as close as necessary, likely lies in its capacity to accommodate individual or collective interest, particularly by upholding intellectual property norms or secrecy in exchange for embracing data openness, framed as serving the collective good. The normative structure of Decision 15/9 Alliance read this framework. By establishing open data as the grading principle, this decision introduces exceptions to preserve a balance between competing claims. This is evident, for example, from its preamble, which recognizes the care principle as presented earlier here, an indigenous standard countering the technocratic and apolitical nature of the four principles. So care stands for collective benefit, to remind, for collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics, asserting that just data openness requires collective benefits, community control, accountability, and ethics. So Decision 59 further embodies these balance with substantive provisions, establishing a principle of free data access, as it is enshrined in Article 9F, while also prioritizing benefit sharing, as enshrined in paragraph, sorry, I mentioned article, this is because I reflect in French. So right, also prioritizing benefit sharing, as enshrined in paragraph 9H, and indigenous rights also in paragraph 9I. So in conclusion, these emerging data and open science framework raises two key issues that merit serious future discussion. First, the digital divide, as open data does not inherently yield collective benefit, given that communities vary widely in their effective ability to use data. So communities differ widely in this perspective. And second, epistemic concerns also, as too often only scientific experts are granted authority and official and international forums to produce knowledge about data and its appropriate uses. One advancement that COP16 might offer in that regard is the adoption of a draft decision for establishing a subsidiary body for integrating indigenous knowledge and all components of decision-making at the Convention of Biological Diversity. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much for your excellent talk. So for our next speaker, they are presently en route on an airplane or in the airport. So they have sent their video ahead of time, which I will play now.
Hi everyone, welcome to our talk about Montañerito Paisa Assembly and the Wise Ancestors model. This will be a shared talk from two speakers, and we pre-recorded it because we are currently attending COP Biodiversity in Colombia. My name is Solène Correa. I am the scientific director for Wise Ancestors, and I'll be presenting Wise Ancestors model later in this talk. To you, Gustavo.
Hello, everybody. My name is Gustavo Bravo. I'm the curator of the ornithological collections at the Instituto Humboldt in Colombia. And so Colombia, it's located here in the northwestern corner of South America. Colombia is divided by the Andes that run from the south of the continent all the way to the north, all the way to Venezuela. And in the northernmost tip of the Central Andes in Colombia, we have this region that's called the Altiplano de Antioquia. There's a place that we see here in the inset on the left, where we see this red area that is a unique ecological region. Naturally, this region was covered by Indian forests and some Paramo enclaves, but now it's been used by local community for cattling and for tree plantations for paper and cardboard. This is how it looks now. So as you can tell, this is a matrix of different kinds of land uses. So we have natural habitats, we have pieces of land that are being cut for planting different crops. And in this region, there's a lot of biodiversity that remains unknown. And this biodiversity is thriving in this place that is really a matrix of a really complex dynamic of human activities and natural ecological processes. The kinds of habitats that we're talking about are just Andean forests on the left. At the center of the screen, you're looking at the Páramo. We have some plantations of palm, not plantations, but natural palms growing in the region. And then on the right, you see that some of these habitats are being modified basically for human consumption and human activities. In this region, not too long ago, in 2008, this little bird was rediscovered. For a long time, we thought it was extinct. It was described based on a single specimen sitting in a collection in Medellin, Colombia, and we thought this species was born extinct already. When it was rediscovered by a local bird watcher, many people just turned their attention into, okay, let's look for this bird, let's try to protect it. And so the Iniciativa de Conservación del Montañerito Paisa, or Conservation Initiative for the Antioquia Brushfinch, was born. And basically, this initiative is trying to bring people together around the conservation of the species. This initiative is trying to do different things to keep this bird with us, to understand what they do, to understand what they eat, and so on and so forth. Based on the last few years of data that we have for this species, we know that the population trends are not good. So what you're looking at on your left is occurrence map for the species in 2022. This is based on searches that we did with the community. And basically the warmer colors are just signaling areas of high probability of occurrence of the species. And in 2023, we see that these areas are just decreasing. So in other words, these birds are losing habitat. In searching for the Montañerito Paisa, we discovered Nampidia, which is a clunky bird just that sits close to the ground. These are typical Andean birds, right? And it had remained unknown for a long time for the community. Nobody knew that this bird was around. When we started looking into it a little bit more, we realized that it's a population that doesn't have a name. So as of now, it's not recognized for science. We're working on describing this population as a new species of bird. And so these two birds became the main focus of conservation in the region. Okay. Therefore, the main goal that we have here in this project is to promote the effective conservation of both species through the integration of community-based initiatives with cutting-edge genomic analysis. In other words, we want the genetics to inform the health of these populations, and we want to bring people together around activities that seek a better knowledge of these birds, and we want local people to be to lead the conservation activities around these two species in the region. We have a framework of 6 different things that we want to do in the mid and long term, but for today and for this project, we're going to focus on only 4 of them. One of them is, and we're going to do that through a program that's called Biomonitores Program. So this is a program that's pretty much a community biological strategy that seeks to train people from the Paisa community, which is what we know people from this region in Antioquia, the Paisas. We want to train them in sampling techniques, taxonomic identification, and biodiversity monitoring, so they remain knowledgeable about the ways to deal with these birds into the future. The first axis of action that we have is, as I alluded before, is the genetic population structure of these birds. So we're gonna generate high quality reference genomes for both species, and we're gonna integrate that with population genomic analysis, so we can infer genetic variation in both populations. We wanna know the population variability that they have, so we can make management decisions around these two species based on that information. All that information is gonna be part of the Earth Biogenome Project, which now the Humboldt Institute is coordinating in Colombia. And of course, data will be submitted to INSDC under the EBB Bio Project. So all this data is going to be publicly available for the community. The second axis of action that we have is what has to do with citizen science. We want to bring people together around getting to discover these birds. We don't know how many we have in nature. We know exactly what they are. So we're gonna promote this initiative so different people try to help us help us find the answers to these questions. Another thing that we want to do, and this is mainly going to be a task for the biomonitors, is that we want to start using remote sensing camera traps and so on for wildlife monitoring. We want to know exactly how many of these birds we have, where they are, what their habitat looks like, what they eat, feeding sources, and so on. And another axis of action is what we call the system ProScare framework, which is protection and production, therefore the Pro Square. And basically what we want to do here is we want to integrate the knowledge of these habitats of these birds into the livelihood activities of these people in the region. In other words, if people are planting crops or they're just having cattle in the region, we want to do it in such a way that we can find a balance between conservation and production for their livelihoods. For this, greenhouses are going to be part of these activities. There's some native plants that are the core of the habitat of these birds. We want to keep promoting them instead of being chopped down. And of course, as I said before, we want the community to help us monitor these birds and provide the knowledge that we need for them.
As Gustavo just presented, Indigenous people and local communities are a key stakeholder of biodiversity. They successfully stewarded their lands for millennia, and traditional knowledge provide additional information about the species, the ecosystem, and the environment than what is known by Western scientists. But the socio-political reality is that biodiversity and genomic resources are not evenly distributed. Genome sequencing and biobanking requires expensive equipment, laboratory access, skilled workforce, and computational resources, which are not always available to Indigenous people and local community. That's why Wise Ancestors was born, with the idea of bringing Indigenous science, traditional ecological knowledge, and biotechnology to conserve biodiversity while respecting each other's boundary and not doing any form of appropriation. So it's the project that Gustavo just presented really fits within our vision. So Wise Ancestor wants to reestablish the trust, and that means acknowledging what happened in the past to not do the same mistakes again. And there is a big history of sample and knowledge extraction from Indigenous lands, also known as helicopter research. And we want to stay away from it and really build partnership. So we will use documents such as the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and the Fair and Care Principle to co-design the project with the community, obtain free, prior, and informed consent, build mutually agreed terms, report back finding, etc. So it's really an engagement and a partnering all along the project, not just at the beginning. There is also, with each of the project developed by Wise Ancestors, an upfront benefit sharing, just like the Biomonitors project program that was presented by Gustavo. We will also ensure recognition of the Indigenous people, local communities, and local scientists. It can be something such as shared authorship in academia, but there is other ways to ensure proper recognition. And to support Indigenous data sovereignty, for the communities who want it, the data generated through the project will be labeled with traditional knowledge and research usage preferences using the local context hub. We will also learn about other ways to support Indigenous data sovereignty during other talks today, and we will make sure to implement it. And so how is the Wise Ancestors model actually working? It starts with step of community engagement, and it starts with outreach and relationship building. So it's pretty much just like we would talk with the community and present to them what we're presenting to you today. If the community is interested in working with us, we would together identify a species of interest. So it could be endangered species like the birds that Gustavo presented, or invasive species, culturally relevant species of food source, anything. Together, we define the technical work that is needed to help that species, such as generating a reference genome and doing population genomic studies, as we will do with Gustavo. And we also identify the benefit sharing component that will help both the community and the species to be conserved in the long term. We will then obtain the prior and informed consent and together build the mutually agreed terms. Once this is all done, we will move to the Wise Ancestor platform. So with all this information, we will publish the conservation challenges on the platform. I will show you what it looks like in a second. But the idea is to inform everyone. It's a publicly available platform about the challenges that we're working on. On this platform, we're also able to raise funds from donors. And once the funds are raised for a project, we will fund the benefit sharing component, and we will also recruit collaborators. So collaborators are academic labs, private companies, core facilities, sequencing facilities, who wants to take part of each project. And each different collaborators can be assigned different steps of each project. So we will coordinate that work and review the technical work. We will generate a final report and pay the collaborators for their work. And we will finally return the results to the community. This is represented as a circle because we hope that the communities will see something positive in working with us and will want to do it again, working on another species. And so hopefully from the return of result, we will be able to go all over this again with other species that require conservation studies.
Hi, everyone. Sorry, we just have 3 more minutes, so I want to respect an opportunity to ask at least one of the questions. So one question that was asked by Dr. Ann McCartney to Katie was direct funding on a project basis to Indigenous peoples and local communities the preference of the IAFB, and is the IAFB supportive of the mechanism being voluntary? Katie, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, sure. So, gosh, there's a couple of things. We were originally hoping that the mechanism would be mandatory, but the parties made a very firm stand on this one that creating a mandatory regime would require a new treaty, and they were really not keen on that. Quickly about her other discussion about why direct funding. It was for a range of reasons about empowering Indigenous communities, and we wanted to avoid high overheads and high consultancy fees. And often by the time that money reaches our communities from funds like this, by the time the dip-ins of kind of people are dipping into the fund, by the time it gets to the ground, it's not a lot. And so we need that money on the ground as soon as possible and not to be caught up in bureaucratic barriers. So the project basis was to provide assurance to the parties that there'll be transparency and accountability so that the funds they can see are being used for the purposes of conservation of biodiversity.
Thank you. Now, on the topic of accountability, I always had this question about the biocultural labels, in that good actors may already be willing to utilize and respect biocultural labels. What about bad actors? Like where's do we even need to incentivize this type of activity, or can we rely on good stewardship of researchers And if we cannot rely on good research stewardship on researchers, because, well, historically the fields have not really operated in a way that have been just, where do we go from here in implementing this system, or really any system?
Yeah, it's a hard one, right? Because a lot of the good actors or the people that want to do the right thing are actively engaged in spaces like this and want to have a say and really help to shape best practice. The bad actors are usually the ones who are not engaging at all because they're not interested. And the problem with a voluntary mechanism and voluntary labels is that it is a coalition of the willing. And unfortunately, with things like biopiracy, at the end of the day, in the absence of law, people are going to do whatever they want to do. But it's very hard to regulate people to do the right thing, especially in open science environments, because with open science, it's free and open access. And so how can you restrict something that's free and open? So free and open access has huge benefits, and there are benefits for us as Indigenous people as well as the world as a whole. But that need for balance really needs to be struck at some point. And I should hope that there is a huge amount of reputational value for companies to do the right thing. And that's what we've been talking about with incentives here, is having certificates of compliance with the mechanism to say, I am a good actor, I've done the right thing, and maybe that increases my public perception and my product is favored over someone who doesn't, perhaps. Yeah, so it'll be interesting to see how over the next few years, how people engage with the mechanism.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you all to our speakers for your excellent content. I also love the fact that this is a global collection of voices vocalizing the importance to attention to Indigenous data sovereignty and biodiversity genomics. And I really hope that this will lead to some fundamental and monumental shifts in how we conduct research from this point forward. But yeah, thank you so much to our kind audience. I hope you all have a lovely rest of your event. Thank you.